So recording. Okay, welcome everyone to the Royal United Services Institute of Vancouver Island's continuing webinar series. My name is Scott Osborne, and I am the president of RCAF. The United States Space Force is the space warfare branch of the United States Armed Forces. Initially formed as United States Air Force Base Command on 1st September 1982, the Space Force was established as an independent military branch on the 20th of December 2019. Today's special guest is Brigadier General Kevin Whale, coming to us from Colorado Springs, Colorado. He is the Canadian Exchange Officer and advisor to the Commander, U.S. Space Operations Command, a subcomponent of the United States Space Force. So thank you, Brigadier General Whale, for taking the time and making the effort to talk to us today about this fascinating topic. Much appreciated. Before we start, some administrative details. Brigadier General Whale will talk for about 40 minutes, and I will pose some general questions, give him the opportunity to expand on his talk. We will then follow that with written questions from you, the audience. Please write your questions on the Zoom chat or Q&A features at the bottom of the screen. Please make them brief and to the point. I will get to as many of them as I can. We end this webinar promptly at 11:30 a.m. Pacific Standard Time. So at about 11:25, I will sum up. As usual, we are recording this talk and we'll post it to our RSUI VI website as soon as possible. So Brigadier General Whale, if you are ready, sir, the floor is yours.
I am. Thank you very much, and welcome to everybody that's on this webinar today. As Scott and I were talking just before we opened up the webinar, I really treat these kind of venues as an opportunity to share what I've learned in the last 4 years or so of what's going on in space and what the U.S. in particular, and then I'll use a Canadian example as well, what we're doing to adapt to it. So appreciate your time, and I look forward to providing you any insights that I can. The way I'm going to do this is I'm going to, I am here working in United States Space Force organization. I'm here supporting the U.S. Commander. So that's going to be the bulk of my focus, is sharing what's going on with the U.S. Space Force, starting with kind of the why we got to a Space Force. I'll talk through some specifics on the organization I'm in and the operational organization that I support. The combatant command, and then I will use the Canadian example at the end, really as an example of allies and partnerships, which the U.S. is so eager to pursue. Most of what Canada is doing, all the other allies and partners, like-minded nations, are doing similar things. I don't speak on behalf of Canada at this point. My counterpart in Canadian Armed Forces Joint Space Program, Brigadier General Mike Adamson. He's the point of contact, but I do have some reference to my previous job. So with that, I will kick off. So the first thing is to understand, not even from a military point of view, we are all on a steep learning curve of what space means to our day-to-day lives. Things like, if I go from kind of left to right on this slide, protecting our planet and the environment. We've all benefited from capabilities on orbit for things like flooding, weather patterns, all those forest fire tracking, all those kind of things, and that's just continuing to accelerate. In the middle there, things like health science. There's a lot of development that's progressed to deal with astronaut health in space and even remote medical systems and those kind of things. That has direct spin-offs to remote locations in any of our nations, and just technology development. Global communications, connectivity, and navigation. Definitely a growth area. We've all used this connectivity from space, and that's again an accelerating issue. International cooperation and collaboration on things like the International Space Station and new programs that are coming online. Timing signals for banking and trade. That all comes through, even if it comes through ground nodes, it is all being passed and set through space systems. Bottom left, things like technological spin-offs that we might not necessarily equate to space development. Things like the type of foam in some of the mattresses, those were originally developed for space applications. The cameras technology that's on all of our cell phones was originated in developing camera technology for space. And even things like baby formula through the development of nutrition in space has had spin-offs into formula that's in all our store shelves. The exploration and understanding of the solar system and beyond for sure is important to all of humanity, let alone our own nations. Economic prosperity, the GDP portion of space in all of our nations is definitely on a growth path. And in the bottom right, certainly an inspiring subject to the youth of all our nations, which is a great thing for all of us. So these are just, I could probably fill half a dozen slides like this, but these are just some examples of over the last probably 5 decades since humans started playing in space. All of these things have developed, and if you could imagine I had a switch and I could turn all of this off, what that would mean to your daily lives and the lives of all of our nations, it's a big deal. So, and until recently, we haven't had a lot of concerns with the domain, and now we do, and I'm going to talk through that. So that's kind of from a general perspective. If I move now to a military perspective, and I could use my own career as an example, all of these capabilities have crept into our military operations originally as an enhancement, but now they're really core to the way we do business. And in my 30+ year career as a helicopter pilot, I benefited from all of this, and I really never gave it a second's thought. So things like missile warning, of course, weather, the position, navigation, and timing, certainly intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance, what's going on in space, so space domain awareness, trying to minimize collateral damage when we're on operations, so things like using these capabilities for precision strike, and of course satellite communication, just connectivity wherever we are in the world relies on space. And again, there's more examples than this, but from a military point of view, again, what started as what we would call an enabler is now become a core part of what we do. There's literally almost no military operation, domestic or deployed, that does not leverage space capability in some manner. So it's a big deal to the way we operate and to where we're going. So with that understanding of the importance in general and specifically to military, what's going on in the domain that's causing all of the allies and partners to change what they're focused on. The first one is congested. There's currently over 3,300 active satellites and counting. And every time SpaceX and others launch a rocket with 60+ payloads on board, that number keeps going up. We are tracking over 25,000 objects now, probably about the size of your fist. We certainly want to know if there's going to be a conflict in any of the orbits. And then there's 500,000 smaller objects, little bolts, flecks of paint, anything from our activity in space, traveling at both man-made and natural, traveling at 36,000 kilometers per hour. So at those speeds, even a fleck of paint can do damage to a space system. And depending on the orbital regime we're talking about, there's different levels of congestion. But just to give you a sense, we are already passing, on average, somewhere in the world, a new satellite per day. We're probably even up closer to a couple per day on average. We're on a trajectory to move towards almost a launch per day somewhere on the planet, and that each one of those launches will have 1 to a few dozen or more satellites on board. So we're moving towards the 10,000, depending on the orbit, 10,000, 20,000, 30,000 plus operating systems on orbit, plus the ones that have gone past their useful life and the other objects that we're talking about. So space is already congested and it's accelerating significantly. So that's one issue that certainly got all of our attention. The second one is the contested nature. When we first started putting capabilities in space, nobody was really messing with it. There was lots of room. There wasn't a lot of interference. But over time, our potential adversaries have noticed, certainly taken note since the Gulf War of how we use these kind of space capabilities. So the picture in the middle, on the left, is the types of temporary interference that you could that can be brought to bear against space systems, and on the right are the more permanent capabilities. So if I start on the left, things like jamming. Everything in space talks through the electromagnetic spectrum. So you can intercept jam the up and down link, fairly easily and fairly cheaply. Everything on orbit is a computer with ones and zeros. So certainly cyber risk is a growing issue for us that we're looking deeper at to make sure that our systems are protected. If I move to the right, even you can do laser dazzling, you could do laser damage. And even things like, China in 2007 did the first anti-satellite missile test, took out one of their own satellites that was, non-functional or decaying, but they, demonstrated that they had this capability, and they created thousands of pieces of debris that are still up in that orbit, dispersing through that orbit. Russia is demonstrating those kind of capabilities, and even India in 2019. Demonstrated that they could do this kind of thing. So, and then the little red satellites on orbit. There's even open source. It's well known that Russia has systems on orbit that we're very concerned about. So all of these capabilities mean all of those first two slides I showed you could be held at risk. And we need to, as nations, we need to be able to defend and protect. So congested. The next one is competitive. When the space race started, there was only a couple nations involved in space. Now there's over 80 countries and growing that are, I would qualify as spacefaring nations. We're moving into, of course, new levels of exploration. The plan for the Lunar Gateway as a sort of stepping stone on our way to Mars. Space mining is a real thing. There are asteroids within reach that have as much of a certain type of specific mineral or asset on a single asteroid than has ever been mined or available on planet Earth. But beyond that, if we're going to move into space, if you look at things like 3D printing, we're going to need access to resources. It could be water, it could be certain minerals or metals. So space mining is a real and growing thing. Things like on-orbit servicing, refueling and repair. A lot of satellites that have fuel on board for maneuver, traditionally until now, when that fuel ran out, doesn't matter if the satellite's still working fine, it's out of gas and it becomes a defunct system. There's already been demonstrations of being able to go up with an on-orbit servicer, grab onto that satellite and then either refuel it, which I don't think has been demonstrated yet, but it's certainly in the works, or be the maneuver element, grab onto it and move it to wherever it needs to go. So all of these, they're just examples, and even things like high altitude pseudosats, where imagine if you're on an operation and you were short on communications, there's already systems that you could launch into the stratosphere in a balloon that could provide, even tactical level communications, for a month at a time during the operations. So these are just examples, but this is a really competitive space now, and it's moving beyond just the traditional nation state. There are commercial drivers that are moving in directions that aren't even driven by military or government needs. So it's definitely a competitive space. So any one of those, we call them the 3 C's, any one of those is motivator enough to relook at what we're doing and how we're doing it from a military perspective. On the left, of course, the first thing is it means opportunity. So the cost of launch cost of entry into space is dropping. Disruptive innovation is accelerating. Those socioeconomic benefits I talked about are growing. The way we can leverage space technology to minimize the impact of humanitarian relief and disaster monitoring continues to grow. Of course, the exploration piece, and then, you know, things like information dominance. I joke a little bit with my Navy colleagues, try and move a Navy ship anywhere on the planet right now and not have your kids be able to track it on the internet. So that's the level of data that's becoming available from space and other capabilities. So those are the opportunities, but of course there are also risks that come along with these changes in the domain. Adversaries access not only to space, but space data. And I could refer to the example of a few years ago where soldiers in, I think it was in Afghanistan or Iraq, were running around the ring of their military base with their Fitbits on, unknowing that their Fitbit data was being posted on the internet, and you could actually see the ring and when they were, you could actually track individuals and when they were running around the track. So access to data, let alone space systems, is an issue. The innovation is outpacing policy and procurement. Our departments just weren't set up for the speed of the rate of change that's happening in space. And, you know, 15-year procurement programs, when the technology changes every 2 years, just are struggling to keep pace. Of course, with the congestion, collisions, and counter space activity, that freedom maneuver that we had for so long is now a concern for us. Treaties that were created, you know, when I was just a toddler are now being tested and actually implemented for the first time. So norms of behavior, responsible behavior in space is a big deal to us. And then if we have information dominance, our adversaries probably do as well. So it certainly changes how we look at this. So the so what of all of this is, hey, we can't just treat this as a side business. There are risks, and we all need to posture ourselves to protect the capabilities that our nations depend on. So for the United States, what that meant was moving towards a space force. So this slide just shows over the years, the top row is sort of the space force line. The US has moved from a Air Force Space Command now to a Space Force, and the organization I'm in, Space Operations Command. You can see how that kind of transitioned over the years to now a dedicated service. On the bottom is the combatant command, which I'll talk about. So there was a US Space Command, you know, from 1985 to 2002. From 2002 to 2019, it moved, space responsibility moved under Strategic Command. But again, because of those 3 C's, it became obvious that that wasn't going to work in the longer term. So it's now moved back to a dedicated Space Command that I'll talk about. So this is where US Space Force and the Combatant Command are today. It's kind of busy, but I'll talk you through it. In general, on the right side of the slide is the service. So that's the organize, train, equip element. On the left of the slide are the operations. And that's the way the US and Canada and others normally segregate how we do things. So on the right, under the Air Force, you got the Chief of Space Operations, and then the Secretary of the Air Force. And that's an important point. Space Force is being stood up as lean as possible so that there's no administrative bloating. The only way that can happen is with the ongoing and continued support of the Air Force. And that will continue in the long term. If you come down to the organization I'm in now, Space Operations Command, it's the first of 3 field commands. It's carrying more weight right now, but as I'll talk about in a couple of slides, you know, that'll be changing. Underneath that, there are wings, garrisons, and deltas that I'm going to talk through in the next few slides. And then a sister organization, Space and Missile Systems Center, which is kind of the acquisition arm, that'll be adapting as well. So that's on the right side. That's the organized, train, equip group that is adapting, adjusting, reforming from the old structures currently. On the left in the upper right, you've got the United States Space Command, so Space Comm. They're the ones that are in charge of doing the operations. So the right side organizes, trains people, equips capabilities, and then it's assigned to the left for operations. And you can see, you know, Space Operations Command is shown twice here, on the right and on the left. That's because we're the primary service component for Space Operations Command. We're the largest contributor to the people and capabilities that they employ on operations. But you've also got elements from the Marines, Navy Space Command, and Army Space and Missile Defense Command. And some of those will be staying on the left, and some of those will be moving to the right. There's a lot of adapting and change that's going on right now. So underneath the United States Space Command, you've got the Combined Force Space Component Commander out in Vandenberg, and this Combined Space Operations Center. And that's an important hub, not only for the United States, but for allies. That's where we integrate capabilities, sometimes people, to make sure that all of our forces deployed anywhere, either nationally or internationally, are getting the space capability they need, and there's some resilience to that capability. Alongside that is the Joint Task Force Space Defense Organization, centered around the National Space Defense Center. So that's kind of that group is focused on the defense and protection of in space, while the folks in the middle there are more concentrated on the services that are being provided to forces around the world. And then, of course, supporting them are organizations like a Missile Warning Center, a Joint Overhead Persistent Infrared Capability Center, and a Joint Navigation Warfare Center. So that's a quick and dirty explanation of how these two sides work, and it can be a little confusing because of the naming. Space Command does operations. Space Operations Command, we are focused on operations, and in some cases, the same people kind of report to the two commanders. So you can be in Space Operations Command, but for next week, you're working in an ops center that's providing a service to Space Command. And that's very similar to how a lot of nations manage these two roles. So narrowing down now just a little bit deeper into my organization, Space Operations Command, there are garrisons and wings. So previous Air Force bases are transitioning to Space Force bases. The Peterson Schriever, that's actually 2 bases plus Cheyenne Mountain. So there's a colonel in charge of the function of that infrastructure. And then the Buckley Garrison, is another element of our capabilities. And you'll see some of those capabilities like Cavalier, Clear, Cape Cod. They're distributed around different places, but there's one focal point for all of that infrastructure. On the right is the 2 launch wings, one out at Vandenberg and one in Florida. And those are the organizations that are focused on not only just the military launches, but now there's an integration of military and commercial, commercial and NASA operations out of single locations. So that's, again, with all the increase in launches, you can imagine their task load is on the increase as well. If I now focus on the deltas, so one of the things that happened as my command stood up as part of Space Force stand up, a lot of disparate organizations were kind of functionally aligned. So on the left, you've got the first one is Star Delta, Space Training and Readiness Group. So that's currently a Delta size. And when I say Delta, think of an air wing. That's a rough equivalent. So that's the team that is focused on how the airmen and guardians are being trained. I'll talk about that in a second. That's going to grow into its own field command. Space Delta 2 is focused on space domain awareness. Delta 3 is space electronic warfare. Delta 4 is missile warning. 5 is command and control. 6 is cyber operations. Again, cyber is a big deal to us, so it's got its own Delta focus. Intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance, Delta 7. Delta 8 is this communications and navigation warfare and looking after the US GPS constellation. And then one of the newest one is orbital warfare. So how we maneuver in space to defend and protect our capabilities. So again, some of the components of these capabilities, they're functionally aligned. So there's a colonel in charge of all those, but his or her elements may be distributed across the nation or internationally, but it's functional alignment, and it's proven to be very powerful. So where is all this heading? By the end of this year or early into next year, this is the vision of Space Force, that right side of that slide. So at the top, Chief of Space Operations, a 4-star general that's now directly on the Chairman Joint Chiefs of Staff organization. The space staff at Pentagon, so a strategic staff is forming at the Pentagon level. And then at the operational level on the left, we have connectivity with the National Reconnaissance Office. My organization, Space Operations Command, with what will be the remaining deltas and the garrisons. Those 2 launch wings will move over to the middle there, Space Systems Command. So that SMC organization will transform into Space Systems Command. So that's think of it as like the ADM material for space. They're the ones that go after the capabilities and systems. Linked with a new Rapid Capability Office to try and move some capabilities faster. And then that Training and Readiness Delta is going to grow into its own command as STARCOM under a 2-star. That's what we're moving to. A lot of moving parts right now to get to that. And if you see the box in the right, that's Chief of Space Operations, General Raymond. These are his current priorities that he's given to us. So empower a lean and agile service. So we really are doing everything we can think of to keep this organization as lean as possible. Developing joint warfighters and world-class teams. Delivering these new capabilities at a speed of relevance. It can't take 15 years. We've got to find a way to move capabilities faster. Important for Canada and other allies, cooperation to enhance prosperity and security. Partnerships with allies and other international partners is a core element of every strategic and operational US document that you can find. And then the last one is create a digital service to help accelerate innovation. So that's what we're moving towards at best speed while we're conducting supporting operations at the same time. Very ambitious. But you can see, again, back to those first slides, this will get after dedicated looking after space deterrence, defense, and protection, as opposed to treating it as more of a side business. My commander has highlighted our vision is, America's space warfighters, ready, innovative, always above. Our mission is to protect America and our allies in, from, and to space now and into the future. And again, note that ally is embedded in the mission statement. It really is an allied effort. Nobody can do everything we need to do in space on their own. So allies are a big deal. Our headquarters mission is that we're going to be focused on generate, present, and sustain combat ready, not just space capability, but in combat ready intelligence, that cyber piece, of course, the space element, and then that combat support forces. So like on those garrisons, all of that needs to be pulled together so we can serve our role as the service component to SpaceCom. The priorities we're focused on are preparing, partnering, projecting. So preparing all those forces I talked about, a diverse, healthy warfighting culture. Partnering, it's not just allies, but it's also commercial partners, interagency integration, and others. We are supporting those other organizations that are forming while we're forming our own field command. And then our primary role is providing capabilities to the SpaceCom. And then the projecting piece, combat power in, from, and to space, and innovation in a digitized force. From an allied point of view, I'll actually, on this slide, I'll start from the bottom and move up. And again, picture all of this kind of collaboration at the Combined Space Ops Center in Vandenberg. So on the bottom is there's all the nations, academia, and industry that are interested in space domain awareness. If you put anything in space, you want to know what's going on in space. So all of these nations are committed to contributing to and understanding the total of what's going on in space. The next level up, multinational space collaboration. So nations that want to start collaborating for military objectives defense and protection in space. This is the kind of place where they start to figure out where they might fit in. And then at the top level there, the Combined Space Operations Center, and things like the Operation Olympic Defender, which currently is a Four Eyes, US, Australia, Canada, and UK. That operation is a framework within which any participating nation can either contribute capability, put in space support requests, or retain capability and provide service. If things start going not great in space, we now have a framework within which we can collaborate. And then even beyond this, the Combined Space Operations currently group, it's currently 7 nations and growing, contributing to our national interest. It's our dialogue forum for operations, architecture, and policy discussions. We want to enhance collaboration. So this is the group that the dialogue is initiated in. Things like operational concepts, how we're all training our people, or how we could collaborate in training. Infrastructure, could we start sharing ground stations, capabilities, those kind of things. All dedicated to identifying future capabilities to support our nation's common interest in and through space. So I guess I would mention here that you see the photo on the right. If anybody has any concerns about, intent in space operations, I can tell you that the more you know about what's going on in the space, the less likely you have any interest in anything going bad in space. The nature of the domain demands that we all protect it for our collective interest, because if it goes bad, like let's say an orbit gets compromised with debris, that affects anybody that wants to go through that orbit, or let alone use that orbit. There is absolute unanimous focus on deterrence, defense and protection, and making sure our forces and our nations get space capabilities that they rely on. So now if I slide quickly and briefly into the Canadian context, just to try and illustrate how one ally integrates. So in the middle, you got the Royal Canadian Air Force, which currently has functional authority for the Canadian Armed Forces Joint Space Program. You got things like the 1st and 2nd Canadian Air Division and the RCAF Air Warfare Center in Trenton. We're moving towards adding a 3rd Canadian Space Division that'll be focused on the space capabilities. So on anything in black is space function. So you see the Canadian Joint Force Space Component Commander and the Canadian Space Operations Center there, just in the left, supported by a Sensor System Ops Center in North Bay for one of our space domain awareness satellites. That's integrated in the Canadian Forces Integrated Command Center as part of the Joint Operations Command. So there, again, the organize, train, equip on the right and the operations on the left, it's integrated right in the middle of all of our operations with connectivity to the Government Ops Center. So let's say when the Chinese space station was re-entering the atmosphere, we didn't think it would make it to the ground, but we were tracking it and we were providing notification to the Government Ops Center, the level of risk that it may or may not, re-enter over Canadian territory, as an example. The bottom left are deployed forces. They have connectivity into the Space Ops Center. We can deploy joint space support teams to give, in location forward space expertise deployed. But they can also reach back through the CAN-SpOC. And if you look into the upper right, that green piece, there's that combined space operations collaboration. So certainly the Five Eyes plus France and Germany and Japan and Italy have been invited to join. There you see in the middle right there, Combined Space Operations Center. We have an LNO function there, and we're probably going to be putting a dedicated individual there for liaison. Just underneath of that, the Canadian NORAD Space Detachment. So we have a deep history of collaboration with the United States, largely through NORAD agreements. There are over 30 Canadians embedded in US units, about 8 different units, providing support to NORAD space capabilities. So think of missile warning and those kind of things. So we've been doing this with our US partners for a long time. And then the integration there in Space Comm and Space Operations Command. In the right, you'll see all the Canadian joint capabilities. So we've got representation at NATO, and I think we're going to be growing that. Intelligence Command is standing up a Geointelligence Space Operations Center. ADM Information Management actually owns our SATCOM Operations Center, and they collaborate with the Canadian Space Ops Center to monitor what's going on with communications in space. All of the organizations in the lower right, so the Army, Navy, Special Forces, the Joint Staff, Policy, S&T, Materiel, there's certainly JAG issues, Force Development. All of those organizations have a growing voice in what's going on in space. And then in the middle bottom, you see our industry partners and other government agencies, like certainly the Space Agency, Innovation, Science, Economic Development, Global Affairs, Procurement Canada, NRC, NRCan, et cetera. So it really is an expansive group. Any military capability that I've been involved in my career, collaboration has been key. It is critical in space. There are so many equities and interdependencies, even nationally, let alone internationally. This is an attempt to illustrate how we try to pull all this together for the benefit of our nations. Specifically, the way the Canadian Forces is organized right now, in 2016, space was pulled under the commander of the Royal Canadian Air Force. And again, anything in black is kind of space, people focused on space business. In the middle right here, you've got the Director General Space, and he's also the Joint Force Space Component Commander. Underneath them, there's a cord element that kind of this linking into the RCAF governance processes, strategy and plans team, and then the ops and readiness team centered around the Space Ops Center. And you see even 1 Canadian and 2nd Canadian Air Division have a growing role in space. For example, our current space training is managed by TUCAD. Just as they are the functional authority for air training, they're also the functional authority for space training. And then the Warfare Center, there's growing capability and representation for space in the Warfare Center. You'll notice also the green and dark blue, bubbles there. This is a joint organization. So there are Army, Navy, and sometimes some soft personnel embedded in this organization. It's a joint capability that the RCAF has been given functional lead for. So it's not an Air Force capability, it's a joint capability, but we're leveraging the horsepower of the RCAF to bring it forward as we need to. All of that's around, close to 160 people today. Where we're going to is we're going to pull more of those functions up into the staffing function. So you see air and space force development. So what was a pure air force development organization now has a team of air, project managers, but also a space team. The readiness 1-star will now have an air team and a space team. And the 1CAD, 2CAD, and Warfare Center roles will continue to grow. But the biggest change, like I said, we're standing up a space division. So remember I said all nations are moving forward within their own context. In the Canadian context, this makes the most sense to increase our ability to contribute and understand what's going on in space. So a space division with a very small staff, some LNOs, a support unit, and then a space wing. And then you can see the NORAD space detachment working through NORAD on the left as well. All integrated through the Combined Joint Ops Command. And if you look at the numbers, we're going towards 275. A lot of those defense civilians, but that's like 2.5 times what we have now. So within the Canadian context, we are moving forward just like the United States is. What frames all of that? Just to give you an idea of the complexity, these are kind of everything that frame that Canadian approach. So certainly the laws of physics you can't violate them in space. So if you hear of a fantastical capability in space, my first question is it physically possible? But then on the left, you see things like the Outer Space Treaty, which was created in 1967. And some of what's embedded in there hasn't really been tested or tried. And it certainly could not have envisaged where the space domain is today. So we're trying to reconcile that. All of the other subcommittees, things like the UN Committee on Peaceful Uses of Outer Space, which Canada is deeply involved in. And then at a government level, it's kind of stovepipe, and it's the way it's evolved over time. Canada has a deep history in space, but it has evolved a bit disjointed. So ISAD owns the Radio Communications Act. So if you want to transmit from a ground station or your satellite, you got to apply to ISAD, who has to go to the United Nations to get you that bandwidth. The Remote Sensing Space Systems Act, Global Affairs is in charge of that. So if you want to put anything in space that takes pictures of the Earth, you got to get approved through this act and prove what you're taking pictures of and not, and how you're storing it and who you're sharing it with and all that kind of stuff. The Aeronautics Act will come into play as we move towards hopefully our own national space launch capability. But even things like re-entry of objects and those kind of things, we have to coordinate with Transport Canada. Certainly the Space Agency Act, which is underneath of ISAD, enormous level of collaboration and in some cases integration between Canadian Armed Forces Joint Space Program and the Space Agency. There really is a lot of collaboration. And then of course the National Defense Act, which is overarching to everything we do in space. So in the middle, Strong, Secure, Engaged, the defense policy that came out in 2016, for the first time ever told Canada, hey, along with our allies, because of those 3 C's, we need to be involved in the deter, defend, and protect game. Under the umbrella of aerospace doctrine, we have initial space doctrine. It's being updated as we speak. And as allies such as the United States update their space doctrine, we're part of that dialogue. So we have Canadian relevant but interdependent, interoperable doctrine. And then of course on the right, the more recent space strategy for Canada, so sort of the civil space strategy. We did a lot of work to try and make sure there was collaboration between those two. Certainly on the security and defense piece, we have to be mutually supportive in our own objectives between civil and military space business. And on the right there, bottom right, is just some websites. You can get additional detail and some additional arguments and expansion on why we're doing everything we're doing and where we're moving towards. So that's kind of the box we are all playing within at present. And that's a quick and dirty around the horn, where I'm working right now, how we're supporting the combatant command, and then the example of Canada as an ally. And the websites in the lower left there are a good resource if you want to get into deeper of anything I talked about. So I will stop there.
Okay, thank you very much, sir. I think that was excellent. I have some general questions for you. Maybe you can expand on a few points a little bit more.
Sure.
Your title at Space Operations Command is described as the Canadian Exchange Officer and Advisor to the Commander, Space Operations Command. What specifically, as a Canadian, are your responsibilities? And amongst those, what would you determine to be your priorities?
Yeah, so the level of collaboration between Canada and the United States is significant. As I mentioned, it has been for decades. We exchange personnel all the time, and now we're just expanding that into space operations. So actually, we're growing on the NORAD foundations that have been established over decades. So this is a new position that started up last summer, recognizing when space was moving from strategic command in the U.S. to under a new service. We wanted to make sure that we had a general officer and other positions in the right locations to look after our independent objectives, and also to contribute to, quite frankly, a lot of the dependencies that we have with with our US primary ally. So right now I'm focused on, because we just stood this up. We set it up initially as an advisor position. That might change over time as this organization kind of solidifies. My commander currently has me focused on champion for major project governance. So a lot of this change that's going on, I'm helping kind of orchestrate that. I'm the one of the front office leads for or how we support Space Command. I'm supporting the strategy and requirements team here in some of the projects that they're working on. And in general, he's asked me to provide advice on how they're integrating allies and partners, which obviously I have some experience in. So that's what he's got me focused on right now. That may change as the organization adapts, but that's what I'm currently focused on. Okay. So I'm here to support this organization.
Okay, and NATO had already designated land, sea, and air as being separate operational domains, and recently made space its own operational domain. Thus, the United States Space Force, I guess, is a separate branch of the U.S. Armed Forces, having the same standing as the other 5 branches of the U.S. Armed Forces: the Air Force, the Army, the U.S. Navy, Marine Corps, and of course the Coast Guard. Can you explain what is the value and why it's important to have a separate Space Force?
Yeah, so again, in general, because of the 3 C's, because of what's happening in space, we have all, I can't name an ally or a partner that hasn't woken up to the reality of what's already happening in space and the fact that we need to accelerate how we're dealing with it. We can't just treat it as a guaranteed service anymore. We've got to defend and protect it. And we've got to move it from an ad hoc to a focused capability. So the US is standing up a Space Force. The UK is standing up a Space Command. Canada is standing up a Space Division. France is renaming their air element to Air and Space Command. So every nation is moving forward in dedicating people, horsepower, and capability to focus on this domain.
If the U.S. Space Force has its own doctrine and Canada is developing its own space doctrine, what are we in Canada doing to provide our personnel with space-specific courses and training? And can we expect to see, like we do now with pilot wings, unique specialist space badges actually worn on uniforms?
Yeah, so Canada for a long time has had its own basic and advanced space training, again, under the direction of the 2nd Canadian Air Division, as well as an executive program, which was my first exposure to space. But we also, because of those deep roots with NORAD's space capabilities, there's been Canadians going through US, which we refer to as Space 1, 2, and 300 level courses. So basic, intermediate, and advanced operational courses, for a long time. We're expanding on that. Those 7 nations that are involved in that combined space operations collaboration are expanding on that. We're trying to make sure that we're all interoperable, and sharing training is a great way to do that. On the badge issue, Canada did look at, as we're growing this capability, should we have a space trade? But when you look at the numbers, 275, 120 of that is probably going to be defense civilians. The uniform piece, both officer and NCO, really isn't enormous, not enough to have its own space trade. But you will find the kind of 3 groups of people. There'll be people that, regardless of their what's normally an air trade, but it could be Navy or Army as well, they may spend their entire career in space. There'll be another group that comes in and out of space that will be deliberately pulled in and out to progress their talent management. And then there'll always be a group of, we have a need and someone's keen to take a break from air or other operations, come in for a tour, and then go back to your normal trade. So because of that, we're not going after wings or anything like that, but we have implemented a space specialist skill badge. So it's a silver badge about the size of a quarter. You can Google it online. There's a couple of Air Force articles on it that we implemented last year. And that badge will represent someone that has training and at least a year's worth of experience in some kind of space capability. So commanders and others will be able to recognize that individual has some space background. So yes, we have started that.
There is, of course, and has been for a long time, public concern over the concept of militarization of space. And even the United Nations established an Office for Outer Space Affairs as early as 1958 to promote international cooperation in the peaceful uses of outer space. And you touched on and mentioned the Outer Space Treaty of 1967. What military activities does the Outer Space Treaty of 1967 prohibit? And what does it allow? Or has that question even been answered yet?
Yeah, so again, that space treaty was originated at a time that no one could have conceived where space is and where it's going today. And that's one of our challenges and why we're increasing our collaboration. I have the list here and I'm probably going to read it just to make sure I don't mess it up. But things like the exploration and use of outer space shall be carried out for the benefit and the interests of all countries and shall be the province of all mankind. So this is really do want to preserve that principle. We don't want anything to happen in space that will limit that. Outer space shall be free for exploration and use by all states. It's not subject to national appropriation by claim of sovereignty, which means you can't carve out a section of space, say above your country and say, this is my area. That's prohibited by this treaty. You shall not place nuclear weapons or other weapons of mass destruction in orbit or on celestial bodies or station them in outer space in any other manner. So the only prohibition, official prohibition, is weapons of mass destruction, either in or stationed in or permanently in space. But again, it's in nobody's interest for conflict to break out in space, which is again why our first priority is about deterrence. We want any potential bad actor in space to know if you take the dangerous move of creating debris or dangerous activity in space, we're all working so tightly together that we'll just share our capability with whoever's capability you just disrupted. So you'll create a lot of noise, a lot of potential risk, and you're not really going to have the effect that you wanted in the end. And there's other things like states are liable for damage caused by their space objects. If you put something into space, you've got to have the policy framework to manage it. All of those things are set out in that treaty. And again, we are working through what are those norms of behavior. So if I could use an example of land warfare. We worked out all the rules over thousands of years. In the Navy, we probably a couple hundred years it took us to work out the international laws of the sea. Air power came along, and within a few decades, we've got some air kind of understanding of what's responsible behavior. Well, now we're in cyber and space, and we're trying to do it in years. So we've got the frameworks, but we're really working out things like how close is too close. If you move your satellite up to mine, how close is too close? Well, there's no rule written anywhere, but there's definitely dangerous and responsible behaviors, which we're trying to influence.
Okay, you've recommended in the past in some previous presentations that Canada draft our own National Space Act, like the United States has, and also appoint a National Space Council. What would having a National Canadian Space Act accomplish? What would be the advantages of having our own Canadian Space Council?
Yeah, so when I referred to that, I was using it as an example. I don't know within the Canadian framework that a Space Council would be the answer, but it's the effect of one national voice. So again, so you've got in Canada right now, and again, Canada has a very deep history in space, deep heritage in space capabilities. But you've got a civil lead, you've got a defense lead. In some cases, like say Transport Canada has a lead, industry has a voice. Nations that have been able to consolidate that into a single voice from the top down, such as the National Space Council in the US that puts out space policy directives, really has a unifying effect. And just to be clear, there is an enormous amount of goodwill collaboration between all those organizations I talked about. I said the Canadian Space Agency, D&D, Commerce, the other agencies, they all work really hard to provide a total that is the optimal for the nation, but they're really kind of doing it from the ground up. If we could find a way to have, something more unifying and centralized, we could move forward at probably a greater pace. So the examples I use are New Zealand, which the launch capability a launch capability company approached that because of their geographic location. They had like to operate in your country. To operate in your country, you need to have a policy framework that addresses all the things that the Space Treaty says you have to address. So what did they do? They developed a High Altitude in Space Act that said, in this nation, if you're going to do space business, here's how we're going to do it. And now that company is launching routinely out of New Zealand. Country like Luxembourg, I presume, realized the potential opportunities in space mining. So what did they do? They created a space mining policy framework. And guess where most of the headquarters for space mining companies are now centralizing? Luxembourg. So again, Canada, with all of these new, kind of think of it like startup nations that getting into the space game, Canada really is in a great position to take a leap forward in where we're going in space. And to do that, we need as centralized a voice as we can. So I'm not exactly sure how that happens, but that's the effect that I would advocate for.
Okay. You've talked a little bit about industry participation and what is meant by the term commercialization of space. Isn't commercialization of space really just about sending tourists into space?
Yeah, so when nation states, when spacefaring nations started, the only ones that had the resources and intent really to put things in space were nation states. That has transitioned over time to partnerships with again, civil agencies and commercial partners. But now there's actually, commercial partners have their own sense of urgency. And I could use an example of, for which they no longer need, or in some cases want, a nation state as the anchor client. So think of capabilities that are on orbit as we speak, 150 imaging satellites. They were launched with all commercial funding. They're now providing not necessarily imagery, but access to their database. So say, for example, Canada would want to know if a ship of a certain size enters the Northwest Passage as the ice thaws in the future. You put an algorithm in their database and you'll get a tip or a cue when their constellation of satellites figures out that there's something like that entering there, and then we can tip and cue other assets. So satellite communications, the commercial industry is certainly advocating that they're arguing they can meet all of our needs. I'm not sure it's all of it, but they can certainly meet a lot of military needs, again, without have to rely on the military as the anchor client. So industry is moving faster than government for their own objectives. And we certainly understand that. We're increasing our partnerships, and we're certainly going to take advantage of those capabilities as they progress them.
Since you joined Space Operations Command, has anything surprised you about working?
The scope, scale, and pace of change. Literally driving the car down the road while you're designing the engine and changing parts. My field command stood up last fall. We're already redesigning our functions. We're carrying capabilities for those other two field commands that are forming. So we're helping them form. We are moving functions that were housed here under Air Force Base Command. Some of them are going to the Pentagon. Some are going to the other organizations. We're re-examining the number of people, how we do business. Just an enormous amount of change. It's exciting. It's the right kind of pace because it's the pace that's required to match the sense of urgency from the 3 Cs. but it is a lot to manage while we're conducting operations. We're supporting forces all over the world today, while we're redesigning, while we're standing up. So, and again, allies are a big part of that. So there's a lot of moving parts right now. It's fun, but it's certainly challenging.
I think we'll go to questions from the audience now. Chris Gaynor, if he's still out there, he raised his hand. I think he wanted to pose a question. And Chris, if you've got a question, please write it in either the Q&A or the chat feature, which you can find at the bottom of your screen. But the first question I've got is from Diane Maddox, and I'll just read it. There seems to be substantial operational detail pertaining to the United States Space Force circulating within the public domain, which includes organizational details. Is there not a concern at the amount of information sharing that could be and likely is being gathered by non-allies or hostile powers on a regular basis? And that's from Diane Maddox.
Yeah, no, it's a great question. And it's something that all space forces are kind of wrestling with. Space has evolved in a very, very protected and in many cases, top secret and above manner. The challenge is, first and foremost, we want to provide deterrence. You can't deter potential allies if they don't know to some degree what you're doing and what your capabilities are. So there is a real concerted effort and a bit of a culture shift going on right now amongst all the allies of, we could keep this capability a secret, but if we don't talk in general or to some level of detail, we won't have that deterrence effect. So there's a lot of discussion right now on how much to share and how much is too much and not enough. But that's the motivation, to share as much as we're already sharing. Integrating allies, there's a lot of advancement going on right now to even myself when I'm in meetings. The restricted elements that the United States doesn't want to share. I'm not offended if I leave the room for the last portion of certain briefings, but that's even advancing. So if you want allies to be an integrated part of your operation, you got to share as much as you can stomach doing. So that's the motivation. It's about that deterrence piece. We want potential allies to know to a certain level what we're doing, our capabilities, and how we're integrating with allies, so that they change the calculus on what they might, any irresponsible behavior they might choose to do in space.
Okay, Diane has also got the second question. It's actually several questions, but has there been any actual space mining for commercial use that's taken place? If so, which countries have engaged in this activity? And if space mining has begun on a commercial level, could you give us an example of a product currently on the market and in practical use that was a result?
Yeah, this wouldn't be my area of expertise. I know there's a lot of capital being invested in space mining, given its potential. Whether there's been currently any space mining, I'm not aware of any. Doesn't mean there isn't, but I'm not aware of it. But again, you can think of, if we're going to put up the lunar gateway, and if we're going to have some kind of a way station on the surface of the moon, it's a whole lot cheaper to mine the materials that are there with things like 3D printers and other technologies to build those capabilities than it is to launch. Even though the cost of launch per pound is coming down, it's still significant. And then, of course, the commercial ones. I'm not aware of examples that have reached implementation yet, but I do know there are metals, minerals, special items in space that if commercial entities can figure out how to get after them, that it's actually will become cost effective to do that.
Okay. Richard Savard and Lord Scallon actually asked the same question. Congestion is a problem, as you indicated, congestion in space of debris and satellites and whatnot, and defunct satellites. What is planned to remove or collect these unused equipment and debris?
So yeah, another great question. It's actually a mix of approaches to get after the challenge. Through the UN subcommittees and other bodies, we are working towards, again, norms of behaviors. So if you launch something now, if you're a responsible actor, you have a plan to dispose of it when you're done. Whether it decays and burns up in orbit, whether you save enough of your fuel to push it off into, I think, what's called a graveyard shift, so it's out of everyone's way, whether you have some kind of a sail that pops out. I know there's experimentation and capabilities being developed for systems that can go up and grab onto a satellite and deorbit it, or wrap a net around it, all those kind of things. So, that's one approach from a responsible behavior point of view. You can design, maybe there could be standards developed. So if you launch a capability, it could have to have some kind of a grappling or some kind of a hook on it, so that when it's done, a certain capability could grab it and deorbit it and those kind of things. We are working certainly in Space Force to raise our space domain awareness. So we're trying to find any way we can to, with all of these capabilities, we want to know to a much greater degree, as high a degree as possible, where everything is, what it's doing. And again, it's no longer just sort of a algorithmic prediction of, I saw that satellite in low Earth orbit a week ago, based on physics and orbital mechanics, it should be here today. And you look up and say it's there. We actually need, just like we manage airspace. I used to use the example of, imagine if you're in a commercial air traffic zone, and I told you, don't worry, we can see about 20% of what's coming in and out of the control zone. You probably wouldn't feel very safe. Well, it's kind of where we're at in space. We need to get a whole lot better at, from radar, from optical systems, from collaboration with commercial partners, that integration that's going, remember that bottom bar of all those countries working through the Combined Space Ops Center on space domain awareness. We're trying to pull in everything we can so we all have as full a view as possible of what's going on with space. So there's just a couple of examples of how we're trying to keep the problem from getting worse, but at least, if nothing else, understanding what's going on. And if you have a maneuverable capability, we'll try and put out a warning so you can move it if you need to, or if you can, or if not, at least we can maybe move other things out of the way if we think there might be a collision. So there's a lot of different approaches to space debris, for sure.
Okay, a question from Richard Young. What is the relationship between NORAD and the organization you designated as Delta IV? Which supports which, or is it a bi-directional relationship?
Yeah, so part of Delta IV's responsibility is to support NORAD. And it was really part of those NORAD organizations are what are forming under the new functional alignment structure. So again, those Canadians in the Canadian NORAD Space Detachment, some of them are in the Combined Space Ops Center, some of them are in missile warning sites, some of them are in training units. They're providing that Canadian contribution for the space capability that NORAD relies on as a service. So now, as Space Operations Command forms and reforms functionally under the Deltas, as we support the Space Command Commander SpaceCom, part of his role is to ensure that service is being provided to NORAD and NORTHCOM. So it is a bit intertwined, but that's what we're working through.
Okay, another question from Richard Young. Canada's initial reaction to NMD, and I'm not sure what he means by that acronym, was not very positive. Has that evolved? It appears to be fundamental to the mission as regards space domain awareness. Is Canada contributing or planning to contribute more directly to that capability as we did back in the 50s and 60s until in 1967 DND got out of the space business almost completely?
Yeah, so I presume he's talking about missile defense. I can tell you what was in the 2016 defense policy. It said we needed to start talking about it. We needed to start looking at it. So I don't think it's any longer a taboo subject. And with things like hypersonic missile capabilities and those kind of things. With the current dialogue that's ongoing about NORAD modernization, as is in the defense policy, I think we're at a point where we're talking about it. Where that's going to go, I have no idea.
Okay, Chris Gaynor has a question, kind of a general question. What is the status of NORAD right now? Is it or will it be renegotiated, or does it need to be renegotiated?
Again, not my area of expertise, but I have some exposure to it. I don't believe there's any discussion about changing the treaty or mechanism that overlays that binational capability, but there certainly is a relook at, you know what, the world has changed. Things like the North Warning System, things like, how does NORAD provide deterrence when a Russian bomber can take off and almost over top of the airfield launch a low profile, low radar cross section missile capability that is difficult to detect. How far forward do we need to project capabilities to provide a credible deterrence? What is Canada, both on the US and Canadian side, how are we going to upgrade all of these system of systems to kind of regain the deterrence effect and make sure we can provide the protection that's required? So that dialogue is certainly ongoing. Where it's going to end up, I don't know. But it's certainly a binational dialogue.
Right, and the next question is also from Chris Gaynor, and it sort of covers the ground you've already walked on or answered. I'll just pose it in case there's anything else that you wanted to add. And Chris says, Canada has not been on board in the past with U.S. ballistic missile defense schemes. Is that still an issue today? Apparently, yes. And if so, how does that affect our relationship with the U.S. military?
Yeah, so again, the only thing I would refer to is it's mentioned in the defense policy as we need to relook at it, talk about it. Where it's going to end up, I wouldn't want to speculate.
Right. Chris also has another question. When the United States Air Force was formed in 1947, it happened only after years of resistance from the other branches of the U.S. military. And of course, for those not aware, all throughout World War II and up till 1947, the United States Air Force was really known as the Army Air Corps and was part of the United States Army. And so forming it as a separate Air Force was a unique event in 1947 for the Americans. It happened only after years of resistance from the other branches of the U.S. military, Chris says. It appears that the U.S. Space Force has not met similar resistance. As an observer of that process, why do you think the creation of the Space Force has apparently met with little resistance from the United States Air Force, et cetera?
Based on what my colleagues tell me here, I don't think it was necessarily little resistance. And just because Space Force is standing up what appears to be relatively quickly, I believe there was a pretty extensive dialogue for a long time. I'm sure there were many long ago that thought this should have happened earlier. But I tell you, the stand up of air forces in Canada's experience is fairly similar. I know there was a lot of debate at the time. There's a lot more a slower moving world at the time as well. And again, if I go back to that sense of urgency that's created by those 3 Cs and other factors in the space domain, it makes those arguments a lot quicker. And once you make the commitment to move out and you start demonstrating the payoff and the value, the return on investment, a lot of those arguments drift away pretty quickly. So I think that's a fading issue, but I think there was a lot of debate. It probably just happened a lot quicker.
Okay, that's all the questions we have from the audience, but I'll just give you the opportunity, sir, if you have any final comments you wish to pass on to this audience about U.S. Space Force or Canada's involvement or the future. If you have any thoughts on that, feel free.
Yeah, I guess what I would just highlight is I got into the space domain capabilities about 4 years ago. My eyes have really been opened, not only to what's going on in the domain, but the consequences if conflict extends into space, what that will mean, not even just for military operations, but to all of our nations. It really has become critical infrastructure, and somebody needs to be focused on it. Somebody needs to be providing deterrence. Somebody needs to be providing defense and protection, whether that's moving something out of the way, whether that's knowing what's going on, to call out a bad actor publicly and say, hey, that's not cool. If you do this, here's the implication for economic prosperity and security. So if we want to be a part of this evolving domain and the economic and prosperity, benefits, we need to be part of defense and protection and making sure that it evolves in a responsible manner. It really is an opportunity of my career to be involved in it with an organization like the U.S. Space Force that's forming. And again, to an individual, the airmen and guardians in this organization, they are all focused on defense and protection.
I would encourage the audience to send me any comments they have about this presentation, and I'll certainly forward any on to you and your staff, sir. In fact, from Chris Gaynor to all panelists, thank you, General Whale, for an excellent presentation. So I suspect in the next few days, people will send me comments and I'll forward them on to you. I want to thank you for the time that you've taken to talk to us today out of your busy schedule, and obviously the effort that it took to put together the presentation. I also want to thank your staff who were very helpful in setting this up logistically. That's your Executive Secretary, Terry Clark, Public Affairs Officer, First Lieutenant Berenger, also Sergeant Armstrong, etc., who were extremely helpful in putting everything together to make this as smooth as possible. And I want to thank you on behalf of the membership of the Royal United Service Institute of Vancouver Island for doing this, and also wish you and your staff all the best in your endeavors in the future. So again, thank you very much, sir.
All right, thank you for the opportunity to share the Space Force and Allied story.
Okay, enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you very much, sir.
Thank you.
And that ends our session.